Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. Like Mike said, we're going to talk today about just some basic common practices for homeowners for managing stormwater. As I think you all are familiar, you've probably been to the RainReady website already, but it's a statewide program from AU Engineering. We're helping property owners, communities, and schools implement practical stormwater solutions to reduce runoff and improve water quality, enhance watershed health. So we're excited to talk about some practices that can help do that today. So this is kind of what I'm going to talk about. We're going to talk about what is a rain-ready landscape? How would you go about making a plan in your home landscape? Ways to reduce impervious surfaces, intercept that stormwater, and reroute it into vegetation, and then how to put it all together, how to put these different practices together in your home landscape. All right, so let's dig into it. So why be interested in a rain-ready landscape? I like to think about this as a way to design your home landscape to manage stormwater in a way that both protects your property, but also reduces the amount of water that is flowing off your property after a storm event, and a way to improve local water quality by helping retain some of that water on site and let it seep back into the earth. So just to back up a little bit and give you a little bit of context for some of the stuff we're going to talk about, why we're interested in stormwater, why it matters. As we've moved to more urban areas, which I think most of us live in now, you tend to see more impervious surfaces, more roads, more rooftops, things like that. And as we build out our cities, whenever it rains, that water, instead of seeping back into the ground and having that deep infiltration, more and more of it is running off into our local storm drains. And that has a couple of impacts. So when you have water rushing across the landscape, it's picking up things that are on the landscape, things like oil, gas, metals, pesticides, fertilizers, and sediment, and that's being redirected into your storm drain and into your local waterways. And that can cause not only pollutants to enter your waterways, but also a large volume of water to enter at one time. So we end up seeing more runoff, less infiltration, less water coming back in, seeping back into the ground, more flooding, and less water flow in our streams. So these are just some of the things that can be impacted by stormwater. So part of this program, is helping think about ways that homeowners can, benefit from thinking about managing stormwater in their home landscape. So rain-ready landscapes, the way I like to think about it, um, you are going to be coming up with a plan to slow that volume of water that's leaving your landscape and think about ways to use it more effectively and efficiently in your own space. We're going to think about ways to spread out that water, let it sink back in, reroute it to wherever you'd like it to go. Develop healthy soils because that's also part of managing stormwater and letting that water seep back down into the ground. We're going to think about how to incorporate plants and native plants into your design, and then what's the role of maintenance when you're choosing these different practices. Hopefully by the end of this presentation, you're going to look at your landscape as more of a system through which water moves and less of just a way to manage kind of individual problems. So start thinking about it as all connected. Just some helpful terminology. You've probably heard the term green infrastructure. That's kind of a larger term that refers to nature-based approaches to managing that stormwater, utilizing plants, soils, and natural processes. That can be anything from a rain garden to a larger vegetated wood, something like that. But part of green infrastructure is low impact development. And they're kind of similar, but low impact development is it's a development approach where you try to manage that stormwater runoff on site or on your, at your house or as close to its source as possible by increasing infiltration, using plants for evapotranspiration. That was a big word for an early morning, or by storing water for later use. So these don't all have to be using vegetation or natural processes, but they're kind of mimicking those natural processes. So a lot of what we talk about today would be considered low impact development. Okay, just a quick run through of what some of these practices are. So thinking about rerouting stormwater, through your landscape or out of your landscape. So that might be things like pipes, French drains, or even dry stream beds. We'll talk more about that. Rain gardens are another great example. Rain gardens kind of temporarily catch and hold stormwater and let it seep back into the earth. Rain barrels are another option. They intercept and hold that stormwater and then let you decide when and where you want to release it back into your landscape. Permeable pavement. Um, Rain barrels and cisterns. I should have included cisterns. Cisterns are serving the same kind of purpose, but they're just much larger. Permeable pavement, that allows stormwater to seep back into the earth without as much runoff, but still kind of gives you the same overall functionality as a paved surface. And then trees and vegetation, they also play a big role in managing stormwater and helping take up water from your landscape. And then if we get to it today, we'll talk about streams, the importance of streamside planting and how that helps prevent erosion on streams if you have a backyard stream, and it helps improve habitat and water quality. Okay, so let's talk about how to do a site assessment. We want to come up with a plan to slow the volume of water leaving your landscape and think about using it more effectively. So things that you want to start thinking about when you look at your landscape, observe it when it's raining, and you want to think about what is the topography of your landscape? What are our current drainage patterns? Where is that water flowing when it is raining? And what's contributing to the amount of water that's in your landscape? You know, your rooftops, your driveways, your downspouts, things like that. You kind of just want to start getting an assessment of how water is moving as a system in your landscape and, you know, start thinking about it like that. So I encourage people to do a kind of an easy map. It doesn't have to be technical. It can be, you know, back of a napkin kind of drawing, but just start getting a little bit of a map of where those impervious surfaces are, your roofs, your driveways, where your downspouts, and where are those going in your landscape. And then are there any areas of ponding or where water's not really draining very quickly? Those are all kind of important things to keep track of. Okay, I just mentioned this, you know, tracking where your impervious surfaces are and where that's flowing. And like I said, your map can be technical or not technical, depending upon what your needs are. This is just a hand-drawn example where someone is showing how they're going to take water from the top right from their gutter, you know, their disconnected downspout, and they're going to reroute it into their garden beds. So your map should show how does the water flow for now? You know, what changes should we make? And it should reflect your goals. You know, are your goals to reroute stormwater into a rain garden or into a flower bed? Or is it to move it away from your foundation? Whatever it might be. So draw out your vision and then, you know, we're going to consider those practices that you could put in combination to kind of meet those goals. Okay. So reducing impervious surfaces. This can be an important part of overall, you know, helping slow that volume of water and thinking about ways to spread it out and let it sink in to your landscape. So permeable surfaces, like I touched on earlier, they're designed to let that water soak in and not run off as most pavement would. So the fewer impervious surfaces you have on your landscape, the less runoff is coming off of your yard. And there's lots of different ways to think about this. You know, that can be stone pathways, it can be stepping stones, it can be these interlocking pavers, but all of those kind of contribute to reducing the amount of runoff. So, of course, still does require maintenance, maybe not as much maintenance as some flower beds or something like that, but it can be a really nice aesthetic way to incorporate that kind of reduced runoff into your landscape. This is just another example of what that can look like in these interlocking pavers. And then here's just an example of a really creative way to reduce impervious surfaces in a landscape. They just only put the amount of pavement they needed for their car tires and planted the rest of it. So, you know, just encouraging you to really think creatively about how you want to go about some of these practices. Okay, let's talk about intercepting, holding, and slowing stormwater. So we talked about all of our goals here to slow the volume of water, to reroute it, spread it, let it sink in. This is part of that. So we talked about gutter systems. Um, Most of us have gutters on our houses. Some of those, um, some of those downspouts are connected to the storm drain system, which means that that water is just automatically going into a storm system. In Alabama, I don't see that as much. Often those gutters are just being rerouted into your landscape. But if not, you can always disconnect them and reroute. So we're going to think about disconnected downspouts and then how to move that water into a stormwater practice, whether that's a rain barrel or a rain garden, something like that. So how can we capture and hold that water, direct it where we want to go, and then release it later? Rain barrels are a great way to do that. And of course, the Rain Ready program has rain barrels, so definitely check that out. But these can be as complicated or as simple as you'd like them to be. It can be as simple here as you see this disconnected downspout. It's going right into this rain barrel, and then they probably empty it into a watering can or a hose or something like that for later use. If you're trying to treat a bigger volume of stormwater, if you're trying to treat most of the stormwater coming off of your roof, you might want to think about something larger like a cistern. That's really kind of up to you and how you're planning on using the water in your landscape. But that is an option. These are just a couple other examples of how rain barrels can look. You can really kind of hide them in your landscape and make them fit in, or they can really stand out. You can also think about connecting them together, or what's called daisy chaining your rain barrels together. And that kind of allows you to capture more storm water, almost like a cistern. So as the first barrel fills up, it just kind of overflows into the second barrel and into the third, et cetera, et cetera. So you have more volume that you can use. Here's another picture of what that can look like. But just, yeah, again, be creative and think about how you'd like to use your water. So, okay, moving directions into rain gardens. We talked about rain barrels. They're often rerouted into rain gardens. Rain gardens are um, kind of simple. They're vegetated depressions in the landscape, and they are designed to just temporarily hold stormwater runoff and then let it sink back into the landscape. And a lot of people are concerned that these are mosquito pits, and I say no. If you design them well, they should drain, hopefully within 72 hours or before, ideally within a day. So, really it's just acting as a kind of temporary catchment system to let that water seep back in. And here's a kind of diagram of how that can work. So you can reroute, water coming off of your roof into your gutter system. You could use a pipe, or you could even put it in a rain barrel and then reroute that into your rain garden. But that goes into your rain garden, hopefully planted with some native plants. We'll talk more about that later. But then that water seeps back into the ground. There's a little overflow area if, there's a large storm event. But it can be a really aesthetic way to manage stormwater, and if done really well, it doesn't even look like a stormwater practice. It just looks like a garden bed in your yard. This is just a little example of, again, how it works. So these are the kind of components. You have an inlet here where the water is flowing in, a ponding area where the water is held temporarily, soil, plants, berm, and then an outlet, an overflow outlet for when that water is kind of coming over the edge. Here you can kind of see ideally what a functioning rain garden looks like. These plants are not fully established, so once they're fully established, you wouldn't really even get to see how much water is necessarily in there, but it begins to fill, the water ponds. It reaches kind of the ideal depth that you've designed, and then that water infiltrates within the next day or two. So rain gardens are really designed to capture that stormwater runoff. The size and the design can really vary depending upon what you're trying to handle, the amount of stormwater you're trying to handle, and just the constraints that you have in your yard. And we have rain design or rain garden design workshops as part of Rain Ready Alabama that you can join or view if you'd like to learn more about how to specifically design a rain garden. But again, like I said, they can be really aesthetic parts of the landscape if designed well. Okay, so let's talk about rerouting water to where you want it to go in your landscape. So we're slowing down the water, spreading it out, letting it sink in, and then, also thinking about rerouting it. So one of the ways, aesthetic ways I think can be really nice to include in landscape is a dry stream bed. And that's kind of mimicking a natural, stone-lined stream bed to redirect rainwater. It can be redirecting it away from your landscape or just through your landscape into other kind of vegetated beds, whether that's a rain garden or just, a tree or something like that. But it can be a relatively low maintenance way to reroute some of that. These are examples of other examples of how that could look in a landscape. This is a little more industrial on the left, but with combined with organized plantings, it can really look nice in a landscape and serve a great function. Here at the Auburn University Davis Arboretum, they have a dry stream bed that's incorporated throughout some of the landscape to help manage stormwater that runs through the site. So, this is what it looks like when it's dry. It still looks nice and aesthetic, but when it rains, it helps just prevent a lot of ponding and things like that throughout the site, and it can just look nice all year. Catch and convey, this is just, another example of what that could look like. This is a creative little cut across a driveway to reroute stormwater from a downspout into their garden bed. This is a little more probably expensive, but just to show you the creative ways that you can do this. Here's another example of a dry stream bed that's also capturing water from a disconnected downspout and moving it throughout the landscape. And then again, thinking at a larger scale, this is just an example of a parking lot. You're kind of doing the same thing, just so you're seeing this as a system of, catch and convey, move throughout a landscape. So this is catching and conveying and then moving it into a bioswale behind the parking lot. So bioswales are similar to rain gardens in some ways. They are landscaped, more designed, vegetated channels that kind of capture slow stormwater, filter the runoff before it enters a traditional drainage system, but they are designed to kind of move that water through a landscape, and they're typically a little more hyper designed with a system, a piping system underneath to help, move that water across the landscape into a stormwater system. So it combines, movement of stormwater, but also vegetation, slowing it down, and filtering that stormwater runoff. These are some examples of just what that can look like, whether that's a home landscape or in a parking lot. Sometimes people choose to cut out a curb, do curb cuts to allow that stormwater from either their driveway or a sidewalk or something to enter, whether it's a rain garden or a bioswale. So just, an example of sometimes that can be helpful when you're thinking about managing stormwater. I just want to quickly mention French drains. For the Rain Ready program, French drains are not necessarily just included by themselves unless they're part of a system that helps manage stormwater from one location into a treatment area like a rain garden or a bioswale or something like that. But French drains can be a really helpful part of managing water in your home landscape. They are, well, you can see this diagram here. There's basically a trench with a perforated pipe that allows that stormwater to be quickly caught and moved away from your landscape, because a lot of people really struggle with having water near their house foundation, and that's really problematic over time. So French drains can be a helpful part of a larger stormwater management system that can help move that water away from a foundation. So just kind of keep that in mind as part of something that you can draw on when you're planning your stormwater system. Okay, let's talk a little bit about vegetation. We've talked about how we kind of want to approach the landscape as a system, but we also have to think about plants and soils as part of that system. A lot of times when we're, especially in new development, you can have really compacted soils that have been, run over by large equipment and things like that. And that can kind of contribute to the amount of water that's coming off your site. So thinking about developing healthy soils and the plants that you want to incorporate can be a big part of that. Um, we often encourage using native plants in tandem with other landscape plants. There's a couple reasons for this. So native plants are naturally occurring in Alabama, so they're better adapted to the kind of different climate issues that we might have. We have a lot of climate variation, lots of rain, but also periods of drought. So those plants can be a little more tolerant of that and require a little bit less maintenance, but they don't require no maintenance. They're also better adapted to pests usually. So incorporating native plants can be really helpful. They also have really deep roots that can help take up some of that water in your yard. We're not going to get too in depth into, the planting designs, but just some things to consider. Think about um, kind of the variety that you want to have in your landscape, from colors to height variation, trees, shrubs, herbs. You just don't want to you're kind of avoiding monoculture. The more diversity you have in your landscape, the better those plants tend to do and the less kind of pest issues you tend to have. So think about plant form and canopy, how they're going to grow as you plant them, and then make sure your plan thinks about the mature plant sizes, just so you don't have plants shading out one another. And then, of course, depending upon where you are in the state, do your homework and see what's available. There might be some native plant nurseries nearby, or you can, of course, order things online, but just kind of see what might work for you. I also encourage people to, especially if you live in a highly visible area or you have an HOA, people tend to be worried about kind of the messy look of, rain gardens or using certain, planting beds. And I'll just say there are ways to do that really artfully and to incorporate what I like to call cues of care, where you're indicating that this is intentional, but it can look natural, and it can look good, especially when you kind of communicate that through, tidy borders or even signs or things like that. Um, just These are just a couple examples of, signs or borders that can kind of make a garden bed a little more palatable if you're in an HOA. So just something to think about. Okay, shifting into stream banks or stream bank stabilization. So, we talked earlier about how as we live in more urban areas and as we have more impervious surfaces, causing more runoff to go into our local waterways. If you live in an urban area, you've probably seen, a local stream that has eroded stream banks because of that large volume of water that comes out of the storm drain, pipes into the creek and kind of can wash away some of those, the stream side. So these are just, a couple of local examples here in Auburn. But one of the reasons that we see that happen so often is that there's often not a lot of vegetation left along a stream. As you can see in this picture on the left, people often like to mow right up to the edge to allow them to see the water, which is great. But the only problem with that is that it it kind of takes away the root system that otherwise would be helping hold that stream bank in place. So it can be really important to plant a plant buffer next to a stream side to help prevent that. So without those plants, banks they more easily erode, but it also has some other impacts. Water can become overheated, and there's also a direct pathway for pollutants to, run across the landscape and into the water. So those kind of plant buffers can play a really important role in helping keep those stream banks in place, but also maintain a kind of healthy ecosystem. So when you see, a stream like this, I think we intuitively know this looks a lot healthier. And one of the reasons for that is, it has these vegetated buffer systems, and there's less erosion. So going back to our discussion about native plants and the importance of root systems, in this middle image here, you can see just kind of how different plants and their root systems are. We don't get to see this underground, but a lot of our turf grasses really have, short roots. But a lot of our native grasses and, native shrubs, they have really deep root systems that not only can help take up that water, but also form kind of stabilizers in the landscape. Um, just to give you kind of an example of going back to our stream bank discussion, if you do have one of these in your yard and you're thinking about stream bank stabilization and plants, you can kind of think about these three different zones. Zone one is that innermost zone right next to the water, and that's really the critical area where you want to have some, native plants planted, protect that area. Zone two, it's a little wider, a little bigger, but you also want to have woody vegetation and grasses along that area as well. And then as you move farther out, this is kind of optional, but maybe that's where your turf grass kind of moves up to that edge, but you could have denser plantings as well or trees in that area. So just something to think about. These are some native plants that can both, be serving a purpose, but also can look really pretty in your landscape. Silky dogwoods, ninebark, sweet spire, black willow, these are all kind of popular plants along a stream bank. And just a quick plug for if you do have an eroded stream bank, of course, consider talking to the Rain Ready program and thinking about ways that you can address it. But there's also a handy little trick you can use called live staking. So you can, in the dormant season in Alabama, probably from, December through February, March, you can go out, find some of these native plants and cut them into, stakes while they're dormant and actually put them back into the stream bank, especially if those roots are reaching some soggy areas or are able to get flooded with water occasionally. And then when spring turns around, those sticks, that are dormant, they will start sending out roots and become new shrubs, new trees, and can help become part of that system for stabilizing that stream bank. So there's a whole publication on this on the Alabama Extension website if you want to learn more. But these are just a couple of, plants that you could use: silky dogwood, silky willow, elderberry, and this can just be a cheap and easy way to manage some of that erosion potentially. Okay. All right. Okay, so let's think about how we can put it all together. We've talked about a lot, and hopefully you've been holding your questions so we can discuss some of that. But, again, step back and think about your home landscape as a system. You can think about how can a rain barrel contribute to a rain garden? How can you incorporate permeable pavement, trees and vegetation? And if you have streams on your home site, think about protecting those as well. So again, it's all part of a larger system that you're trying to plan in your home landscape. So going back to the Rain Ready program, just visit their website to see what's available. There's assistance with low impact development, green infrastructure, but also stream bank stabilization, and of course, rain barrels. So with that, I think I've left enough time for us to have some questions. So we'll open it up and hear what anyone has to say.
Thank you, Laura. So if you do have questions, you can use the Q&A button on the bottom, and as those come in, we'll be happy to answer them. It could be questions about the presentation, questions about Rain Ready in general, about the program. Um, yeah, fire away. Laura, what do you think are the most common practices you see, or the easiest practices a homeowner can implement?
Right. I mean, a lot of the time, some of the barriers to these practices are, finances, because they can be expensive. So I think some of the easiest things to implement are rain gardens. Those are things you can easily do either yourself or with, a little help. Even just things like planting additional plants or rerouting your gutters into different systems on your landscape. I would say those are kind of the lowest hanging fruit, but also rain barrels. Rain barrels can be a really helpful way to help, capture it immediately and then let you decide when and where you want to put it. So those would be kind of my top three low hanging fruits.
Let's see. If we want to build a rain garden, what are the best resources to look at or study?
Okay, great question. So you can go to the Alabama Extension website, and we have a whole publication on how to design and implement your own rain garden. But we are also going to be hosting some more webinars exactly on that topic where we'll, talk through what's in that manual and how to design it specifically for your own landscape. And then we can have some more Q&A. So those would be good places to start.
Yeah, and we do have that manual linked on our website. So if you scroll down to educational guides on our page, you'll see it down there. It's the homeowner's guide, how to install a rain garden. And then we also have the upcoming rain garden workshop that Laura was just talking about. The next one is on August 11th at 3 p.m. And you can register for that on our website as well. And those are all free to attend. Could implementing rain-ready practices like a rain garden and riverbed eliminate the need for retaining walls to prevent washing?
Ooh, I think that's a tough question. It's kind of site dependent. I don't know that it would, I wouldn't want to say definitely yes or no, but it could assist in that. Um, yeah, I think that would kind of be a deeper question that would require more of a specific site analysis. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, it's very site specific. There's no blanket answer to that. It really depends on what you have going on in your yard. Uh, Oftentimes you can get away from a retaining wall if you have very good vegetative cover and you're okay with the slope that you have. Oftentimes people put in retaining walls because they want more flat areas to put in, backyard seating areas and that kind of thing. Um, it's just kind of just depends on what you've got. But Elizabeth, if you'd like to send us pictures to the Rain Ready website, we'd be happy to, or the Rain Ready email address, be happy to take a look and give you some ideas. Do you have a list of affordable resources for pervious surfaces?
That's a great question. That's not something that I have put together yet. Um, Mike, do you all have any resources on that?
Yeah, it depends. We don't have a list available, but it depends on what you want to do. So if the the easiest way to do permeable surface is you use just rock, 57 stone. It's like size of a quarter in diameter, basically, but just rock and creating a walking path that way or a driveway. If you're going to have vehicles on it, there's certain grids that you can put underneath that help hold the rock in place. So when your tires turn, they don't, move all the rock with them. That's the cheapest. And then from there, you can get real pricey. There's very fancy pavers you can get, and you can go pervious concrete, where it's actually poured concrete, but it's designed in a way where water can still infiltrate through it. I have a storm drain creek in my backyard with lots of trees and roots. Would you recommend rocks in the stream to help the water be cleaner?
If I'm understanding that question, um, they might be referring to the fact that you often see riprap or, rocks put along eroding areas in a stream to help with stabilization. Um, I mean, my first take on that question would say that's not necessarily the route you want to go to. I think rocks are often really helpful in kind of disrupting the amount of volume that could be coming from your I think you said it was, from a storm drain or something like that. So it could be helpful in at the kind of, front area where that amount of water is entering the waterway. But I think using native plants along your stream bank as a stabilizer you're going to have better results over the long term because those natural root systems, they're just going to be much better at actually holding that in place. Whereas riprap can actually cause more erosion over time because it doesn't actually, hold that stream bank in place. Does that make sense? Mike, you might do a better job of explaining why that is.
Uh, I think that's great. Yeah, again, very site specific, and site dependent. Uh, Riprap provides cover and it helps armor the slope. Um, it's not necessarily going to treat water or clean water, but it depends on the site. And oftentimes vegetation alone can provide the stabilization that you need. Uh, it depends how much water you have going through.
That's true. And there are tools, probably more expensive tools, like things like what's called Fleximat, which is kind of
Mhm.
you almost think about it as like a blanket of stone that people use to help stabilize, but you can also plant within that. So anyway, that's a something to research a little more, but again, it's pretty site specific.
Yeah, and so following up to that same question, if there's a lot of shade in that area, how do you keep plants rooted? How can you establish vegetation?
Mm. Well, you can do some research about plants that thrive in shady areas. So, certain plants are just better adapted to that. So I would start with that. Um, yeah, and again, it's kind of it's kind of challenging because you have to think about your certain site. But I would do a little research to think about what what plants or shrubs would are fast growing and thrive in shade. I mean, even things like some of the plants I mentioned, like elderberry, for example, they don't mind shade. They grow really fast, and they would probably do really well. And you may have some frustrating experiences where what you plant doesn't establish, but I talked about life staking too. That can be, a kind of low cost way to just get a bunch of those into a stream bank and just see what survives. So again, kind of depends upon your needs and your site specific context, but do a little research, think about the plants that would do well in shade.
Yeah, there's definitely shade tolerant plants. And then even for your yard, if you've got a lot of bare areas, there's shade tolerant turf grasses. Like zoysia is a great example. And we use that anywhere where you have a lot of shade that Bermuda doesn't do well in shade and it's going to end up, burning out or dying out. And then you're left with just a patch of soil. The zoysia can be very useful in those areas. Awesome. Well, those are all the questions we've gotten in. If you think of anything else, please feel free to reach out to our rainready.auburn.edu email address. I encourage you to get your applications in if you're considering doing a project, because we've got funding that's available through mid-September. So we've got to go ahead and get those in as soon as you're able to. Oh, got one more question, and I don't know the answer to this. Are oak leaf hydrangeas good for shade?
They are, yeah, they do
Okay.
pretty well in shade. And now I don't know about their tolerance for having wet feet. So I'm not sure whether they would do well in like the middle of a rain garden, but they do thrive in partial shade.
Well, Laura, thank you so much again for joining us and for leading this workshop. Thank you all for attending and look forward to seeing your projects.
Yeah, thank you all.